I was a private investigator with my own agency for the last 12 years. I started out as a police officer and learned the ropes there. After a couple of years, I decided to become my own boss. I usually took on 1 or 2 cases at a time, depending on what I needed to do. I made a great living and set my own hours. I was 38 years old and had been divorced for a year. My marriage lasted less than 6 months. I dated many women throughout my life and never had trouble finding dates. Being a decent-looking male with financial stability and a promising future was appealing to many women. My ex-wife was close to my age, a nice-looking woman who was a good partner. We dated on and off for about a year before she convinced me to take her to Las Vegas, where we got married. I liked Margaret well enough, but I can't honestly say I loved her. I suppose I thought it was time to settle down. We moved into my condo, which had all the amenities, a pool, a hot tub, a fireplace. It was a really nice place. Margaret lived in an apartment and worked as a beautician in a small salon. She wanted to own her own salon, which I suspected was part of the reason she wanted to get married, to have me buy it for her. After about a month, I bought her a small salon with 4 chairs. She hired 2 friends, and she, of course, was the owner. I didn't pay much attention to her business, but I suppose she was doing well. One Saturday, she mentioned she had a couple of appointments and would be home later. I told her that was fine. I had a case I was working on and would be out most of the day. I was a few blocks from her salon and needed to use the restroom, so I decided to stop by her place. When I arrived, the sign in the window said closed. I assumed she was done early and had gone home, so I used my key to get in. As I headed for the restroom, I heard sounds coming from the office. I knew what those sounds were, being a private investigator, but I didn't know who was in the office. I cautiously approached the door, felt the doorknob, and realized it wasn't locked. I took out my firearm, which I always carried, and opened the door quickly. There was my wife of a few months, with her skirt up and sitting on the lap of another man. I must have startled them as Margaret screamed and called out my name. Her lover tried to get up, but I intervened by striking him once, leaving a bruise and scratch on his cheek. I told him to get up and leave immediately, warning him that the next time I saw him, he wouldn't be so lucky. He hurriedly dressed and left. Margaret was crying and tried to explain that it wasn't what it seemed. I told her to be quiet. She was supposed to be my wife, and here she was with another man. Our marriage was over. I gave her 2 hours to collect her things from the condo and leave the key on the kitchen table. If her belongings were still there when I returned, I would throw them out onto the pavement. I then left and went to my friend's house. He was a lawyer and didn't work on Saturdays. He invited me in, and I told him I wanted a divorce as soon as possible because I had caught Margaret with another man just minutes before. I mentioned that she could keep the salon. I had no use for it, and that was all she would get. If she wanted to contest the settlement, so be it. I had a prenuptial agreement, and she would lose the salon if she fought the divorce. My lawyer, Roger, called me while Margaret was packing. According to Roger, she was crying and agreed to the terms of the prenuptial agreement. She didn't yet know where she would live, so any communications could be sent to the salon. The divorce proceeded smoothly, as expected. Roger informed me that the man she was with was her old boyfriend, and they had rekindled their relationship after our separation. That was the last I saw of either of them. I returned to being single, which suited me just fine. I was working on another case involving infidelity and had to stay at a local inn to keep tabs on my client's wife. It was a standard case. She had told her husband she was taking a trip with her boss, and they shared a room at the motel. I had discovered their room number and set up 2 surveillance cameras. I had a lot of connections in various businesses, including the motel employees, and paid them well. All I had to do was wait until the next morning to retrieve my tapes. While sitting at a booth in the lounge enjoying a drink, a young, attractive woman approached me, dressed provocatively, and asked if I wanted some company. I was taken aback that someone so pleasant felt the need to work in this manner. As I was about to decline, the manager approached her to inform her that solicitation was not allowed in the establishment. I quickly stood up and asked where she had been. She was half an hour late. The manager apologized and left. I wasn't sure if he believed my story, but it didn't matter. I invited the young woman to sit down, and she seemed extremely nervous. She thanked me for defending her and mentioned she was new to this and unsure of what to do. I asked her name and she said, Dolly Weiss. When I asked for a real name, she looked up and said, Peggy Sue Williams. She then asked if I wanted her services, and if not, she would need to leave as she needed to earn money. She revealed that she didn't have a pimp and had never used drugs. She was trying to earn money for her daughter. I was intrigued and concerned for her well-being. I asked her how much she would charge for the night. She was startled by the question and unsure about her rates. I offered her $300 for the night and asked if that would be acceptable. She agreed, and I asked her what was required for that amount. She was confused but said she was willing to come to my room. I handed her 3 $100 bills and led her to the elevator. We didn't talk much until we reached my room. I unlocked the door and let her enter. She seemed anxious but came inside. I followed it and closed the door. She started to unbutton her blouse, but I stopped her, saying it wasn't necessary. I asked her to sit either on the bed or on the couch. She chose the couch, and I took a chair beside her. She looked at me and asked what I wanted since I had paid her $300. She wondered if I was a police officer. I told her, I want to help you if you will let me. I used to be a police officer, and if I were still in that role, I would have had to take you into custody tonight. I understand that you're confused and may be skeptical about my intentions. Let me explain. My name is Dan Gray. You can call me Dan or DG. I see that you're facing some difficulties, and for some reason, I feel a strong concern for you. If you're willing to talk to me, I'll see if there's any way I can assist you. I don't believe you truly want to be in this situation, and I think you deserve help. Are you willing to talk with me about it? Peggy, I realize you might question why someone would want to help you without expecting something in return. It's true that people often have ulterior motives, but I genuinely want to offer support. I understand you need money for your daughter's medical expenses, especially after losing your insurance. But let's address how you ended up in this situation. How long have you been involved in this line of work? My guess is that it hasn't been very long. Peggy started to cry. She told me that this was her first night, and I was her second client. She needed the money urgently for her daughter's medical needs. She explained that she had been on the street, and a man offered her $20 for a specific service. After complying, he suggested she looked more suited for work in a motel rather than on the street, which led her to approach me. I expressed my concern about the risks she faced, how she could have been arrested, harmed, or worse. Her daughter's situation was clearly weighing heavily on her. I reassured her that I was here to help and asked her to be honest about her situation. I wanted to understand her background to see how I might assist her. Peggy said that this was the only time she had engaged in this work and began to share her story. She told me that when she was about 7 years old, she became a ward of the state after her parents were arrested by the police. Her caseworker informed her that her parents were involved in drug dealing, though she didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. As she grew older, different foster parents tried to explain it to her, and she learned that her parents had gone to prison. I haven't heard from them since, but one of my foster parents mentioned that my dad was killed while in prison. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I moved from one foster home to another. Some of the families were really kind, while others treated me poorly. I guess they had preconceived notions about me due to my parents' background. Despite the instability, I did well in school, but I struggled to make friends because when people learned about my parents, their families would discourage them from associating with me. It was a tough experience, and it felt like I was being judged for my parents' actions. As I grew older, I tried to adapt to each new family, but I never formed close bonds because I was always moved to another home. I wasn't fond of the last family I stayed with when I turned 17, but I had to endure until graduation. I met a boy named Tim Addy at school, who became my boyfriend. After graduation, I turned 18 and ran away with Tim. We rented a trailer. I started at a community college and worked at a store while Tim got a job at a local factory. When I became pregnant, Tim said he was too young to be a father and pressured me to have an abortion, threatening to leave if I didn't comply. I wasn't willing to give up my baby, so Tim left us. I continued working as much as I could until the baby was born. A friend I met at the market moved in with us to help with rent and expenses. I had to quit school after Trina, my daughter, was born. Despite that, I managed to get a job at a local bank doing bookkeeping. It was a decent job and provided insurance for Trina and me. I still had some medical bills from before I had insurance, but the hospital allowed me to make monthly payments. That's how things have been for the past 3 years. Sue, my roommate, and I share responsibilities for taking care of Trina. I work during the day, and Sue looks after Trina while I'm at work. At night, I take over. Recently, Trina developed asthma, and the doctors prescribed medication for her about 3 months ago. When the bank announced layoffs, I was among those affected. After being laid off, I struggled to find another job that provided insurance, as I didn't finish college. I was getting unemployment benefits, but my insurance coverage ended, and I faced a growing financial strain due to Trina's worsening health. I was scared and worried about my daughter, but didn't reach out to children's services because of my own experiences and fear they might take Trina away from me. With mounting medical bills and no other options, I felt desperate. One day, I looked in the mirror and thought maybe someone would pay for my company. Despite my reservations, I decided to give it a try for the sake of my daughter. Peggy started crying again. I reassured her that everything would be okay and asked if she was hungry. She hadn't eaten recently, so I ordered sandwiches and salads from room service and got a soda for her and some beers for myself. While waiting for the food, I turned on the TV to watch the news and continued talking to Peggy. She told me she was 23 and her daughter Trina was 4 years old. During the news broadcast, there was a segment about a special award being given to someone named Harold Batty for his charitable contributions. I noticed Peggy's reaction. She grimaced, but she didn't say anything. I turned off the TV when there was a knock on the door. It was my friend Rob, a hotel employee, bringing our food. I asked him how things were going next door, and he laughed, mentioning he had heard some noises. I reminded him to call me in the morning before cleaning the room. He agreed, and I gave him a generous tip. Peggy asked about the interaction with Rob, so I explained that I was conducting surveillance for a client and needed to complete my work first thing in the morning. As it was getting late, I offered Peggy a place to stay for the night, suggesting she take the bed while I used the couch, which could be converted into a bed. She asked if she could call her friend Sue to check on Trina. I overheard Sue saying, "You did it, didn't you?" Peggy replied vaguely and said she'd explain more in the morning. Sue reassured Peggy that Trina was okay and had gone to sleep after taking her medication. Once we finished eating, Peggy cleaned up while I took some notes. I needed to verify Peggy's honesty if I was going to help her. When she came out of the bathroom, she was wearing one of my long t-shirts and asked if it was okay. I smiled and said the t-shirt had never looked so good. I went into the bathroom and took a shower. When I came out, Peggy was fast asleep, looking serene. I hoped she had been honest with me. I genuinely wanted to help her. The next morning, I got up early while Peggy was still asleep. I left her a note, reminding her to be there when I returned. I went to a local Walmart that was open 24 hours. I bought a blouse, a pair of jeans, a package of underwear, and sneakers for her. I also visited the cosmetics counter and picked up some cologne and lipstick that I thought would suit her. Realizing I had forgotten a bra, I went back and got one, then packed everything into an overnight bag and headed back to the motel. As I opened the door, I heard Peggy singing in the shower. She had a pleasant voice, and I imagined her singing to her daughter. When the shower stopped and the bathroom door opened. I must have startled her. She let out a small scream as she stood there wrapped in a towel. She looked great. I handed her the overnight bag, and she asked what it was. I told her it was clothes because I didn't want her going out to breakfast in what she was wearing. She took the bag and went back into the bathroom. A few minutes later, she emerged smiling and asked how I knew her sizes. I explained that when I went to the bathroom the night before, her clothes were scattered, and I noticed the size tags. I guessed the jeans based on her skirt and chose the cologne and lipstick because I liked them. She thanked me and gave me a kiss on the cheek. Then she asked what would happen next. I told her we'd go to breakfast, return to the room, and after I finished my work, I'd make sure she got home. After breakfast, Peggy looked great in the jeans. She could have passed for my daughter. She was lovely and smelled wonderful. She was cheerful throughout our meal. I went next door to collect my tapes. Judging by the state of the room, my client's wife and her boss had spent the night. I planned to deliver the tapes to my client later. I asked Peggy if she had driven to the motel the night before. She laughed and said her car was so old it would be a classic if it were in better shape. It was just an old rust bucket that got her around. As we prepared to leave the room, Peggy offered to return the $300, saying she didn't earn it. I insisted she did, so I offered her the same amount to spend another night with me, just talking. She cried again, her emotions on full display. We got into my Mercedes, and I drove her home. She lived in a trailer park not far from town. As we drove, I asked her to promise she wouldn't try selling herself again. I gave her my card and told her to call if she needed anything. Otherwise, I'd check in with her in a few days and reassured her everything would be all right. As she got out, she gave me a big hug and kissed me on the lips, repeatedly thanking me as she took her overnight bag and went inside. I stopped by my office to make a few calls. I reached out to a contact and asked her to gather information on a few names: Peggy Sue Williams, Tim Addy, and Harold Batty. I requested that she keep it discreet and update me as soon as possible. Then I called my client, informing him I had tapes that confirmed his wife's affair and that they should provide all the proof he needed. We arranged a meeting for later that day. I reviewed the tapes. His wife was quite attractive and seemed very involved in her activities. One tape showed her with her boss, and later, another woman joined them. The footage included intimate moments between the two women. I ran the second woman's photo through a database, knowing my client might need her identity. I met with my client and advised him to view the tapes alone. I mentioned that the recordings were made without the recipient's knowledge, so they couldn't be used in court, but could be valuable for leverage. I also provided him with a tape of the hallway monitor showing who entered and exited the room at what time. That tape could be used in court. He paid me, and I left. Unfortunately, I might have initiated another divorce proceeding, but that's part of the job. When you play, you pay was my motto. Returning to my office, I had a message from my contact to call back. She provided information on all three individuals: Tim Addy, Peggy Sue Williams, and Harold Batty. Tim Addy worked at a local factory. His name was in the database because he was caught with a small amount of marijuana during a traffic stop about a year ago. He paid a fine and completed some community service, nothing serious. Peggy Sue Williams, however, had a more complex background. She was a ward of the court from a young age after her parents were imprisoned for drug-related offenses. Her father died in a prison riot about 10 years ago, and her mother was released and moved out west. Since Peggy wasn't on the official list, my contact didn't investigate further. Peggy had run away from her last foster home and had accused the foster parent of assault. However, the police found insufficient evidence, and the case was dropped as the man claimed it was consensual and questioned why Peggy had waited 2 months to report it. My contact also noted that Peggy had a child. The most significant discovery was about Harold Batty. He was the accused assailant and was set to receive an Outstanding Citizen Award in a few weeks. There was no further information on Peggy other than a recent traffic ticket for an unsafe vehicle. I thanked my contact and ended the call. Everything Peggy had told me was accurate except for the assault claim. Her reaction had suggested she was honest. I decided to visit Mr. Batty after a busy day and headed home. I thought about Peggy, her difficult past, and her sick child, and felt a growing sense of care for her. I went to bed early, tired from the hideaway bed, but with the knowledge that Peggy was close by. I woke up to my phone ringing at 4:30 a.m. It was Peggy, sounding anxious. "Dan, is that you?" she asked. I recognized her voice immediately. She explained that Trina was having trouble breathing and needed to be admitted to the hospital. She asked if she could borrow money for Trina's admission. I told her to have the doctor admit Trina and I would be there in 15 minutes. I dressed quickly and headed to the hospital, knowing they had to admit children without delay. I was frustrated by the unnecessary difficulties Peggy was facing. When I arrived, Peggy ran to me, and the doctor apologized for the admission error. I told him to apologize to Peggy, as she must have misunderstood him about her daughter's admission. The doctor expressed his regret to Peggy, and I went to the admissions desk, offering my credit card to cover all charges for Trina. I also asked for an itemized bill, and to add any remaining balance to the account. The clerk seemed concerned, likely having informed the doctor of the outstanding balance. Peggy, tearful again, hugged me and thanked me repeatedly. I assured her that everything was taken care of and that Trina would receive excellent care. The doctor returned, saying Trina's breathing was under control and they would keep her for a few days to run tests and determine the appropriate medication. Peggy and I then went to the cafeteria for coffee and talked for a while. She expressed her gratitude, saying she had never met a man like me and didn't know men like me existed. I reassured her, "No more tears. I'm here if you need me." I felt compelled to help a stranger, unsure why I felt responsible but driven to do so. Peggy mentioned wanting to return to Trina's room, and I told her to call me later in the day because I would like to see her at my office when she had a chance. There were a few things I wanted to discuss with her. She said she would repay every dollar I'd loaned her, even if it took the rest of her life. I just smiled and mentioned that I liked the idea of seeing her for that long and might just hold her to it. Later that day, she called and informed me that Trina was doing well. The doctor said that the medications hadn't been effective, which was why Trina experienced the breathing flare-up. However, now that she was tested, they were confident they could find the right combination, and Trina would likely be released in the next couple of days. She thanked me again and said she hadn't forgotten that I wanted to see her and would come by probably the next day when her friend Sue would be with Trina. 2 days later, a car emitting blue smoke pulled up in front of my office. I watched Peggy jump out, smiling when she saw me at the door. She asked how I knew she was coming, and I told her I heard her car's noise and saw the smoke 10 minutes ago. She laughed and came into my modest office. As she entered, she saw a beautiful woman at my reception desk and looked taken aback. I introduced the two women. "Peggy, this is June. And June, this is Peggy, the woman I mentioned to you." They greeted each other, though there was an air of curiosity. June, my younger sister, had always been protective of me, often watching any woman who approached. She had previously voiced disapproval of Margaret, and look where that led. I had told her about Peggy, which was probably why June scrutinized her so closely. June had been working for me for years, but had been working fewer hours recently. I wanted her opinion on hiring Peggy, so I planned for June to interview her for the position. After the two women finished their introductions, I asked Peggy into my office and asked June to hold any calls for a few minutes. Peggy followed me into the office, and I took a seat behind my desk while she sat in a chair. I asked about Trina, and she said Trina was doing great. Peggy mentioned that my help had likely saved Trina's life, even though I hadn't met her yet. She said she could see the warmth in my eyes and knew I had a kind heart because of everything I had done for her and Trina. "Well, Peggy, I have a couple of things to discuss with you," I began. "I'm not talking about money. I needed to ask her some questions and required complete honesty if I was to continue assisting her. "I've been honest with you, Dan," Peggy said. "I know about the assault," I said. She started crying, so I got up, went around my desk, and held her. "I didn't mention it, Dan, because nobody believed me, so I figured why would you? That's why Tim left. He didn't want to be a father to someone else's child. I'm sorry, Dan. Everything else I explained to you is true." She sat back down, and I pulled a chair next to her. "Peggy, you can have a DNA test done, and if it proves positive, he would be required to pay child support. He admitted to having sex with you, although he claimed it was consensual. However, if he assaulted you, I understand why you wouldn't want him near your daughter. You can appreciate that, can't you?" "Of course I can," Peggy replied. "I was only thinking about your financial situation. I'm sorry. Are you okay?" I asked, thinking ahead. "I mean, with work, do you have experience in bookkeeping, accounting, and general office tasks?" "I think I'm capable," she answered. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm considering offering you a job," I said. "It depends on my sister's opinion. She's a great judge of character. If you're interested, I'll have her interview you." "That beautiful woman out there is your sister?" Peggy asked. "I would love to interview for the job, especially if it includes benefits." She smiled, and I wasn't sure if she was pleased about the job opportunity or June being my sister. I called June in and told her I had to leave to work on a case involving infidelity. I asked her to have Peggy fill out an application and conduct the interview as discussed earlier. I said I would be back later to talk about it. Peggy thanked me again for everything, and I told them they could use my office and I would see them later before leaving. I hoped June liked Peggy as much as I did. I promised June I would abide by her decision. A few hours later, I called the office and informed June that I wouldn't be able to return that night due to working on the infidelity case. She asked me if I was ready to discuss Peggy. I replied that my focus needed to be on my current task, but I would call Peggy and let her know that I'd give her an answer by tomorrow. I knew June could sense my anxiety in my voice. She said, "Dan, I'll give you my full assessment on Sunday, but while you have Peggy on the phone, let her know she starts on Monday. Bye, big brother." She then hung up. I was relieved. It was great news. It would be interesting to hear June's thoughts, as she was an excellent judge of character. With that in mind, I smiled and went to gather information on another case of infidelity. It seemed like people no longer valued their relationships. For once, I wished to discover that the spouse wasn't cheating, just a misunderstanding on the client's part. Unfortunately, that hadn't happened yet. Usually, where there's smoke, there's fire. What an original insight. I gave Peggy a quick call. She answered eagerly, asking, "Well, did I get the job?" I hesitated before replying. I had a tendency to do that. "Dan, are you there?" I heard a hint of sadness in her voice. I couldn't leave her hanging. "Yes, Peggy, I'm here," I said softly. "I didn't get a chance to speak with June for long, and I won't be back tonight. She told me to tell you that she prefers you wear skirts and blouses or a business outfit, and that you should be there Monday at 9 a.m. Do you think you can make it in that old car of yours?" I could hear her crying again, but this time it was tears of joy. "Oh, Dan, I'm so happy. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You've done so much for me and you hardly know me. I'll be there if I have to walk." Listening to her brought tears to my eyes as well. I had to refocus on my work, so I told her she was welcome and that I would see her on Monday. I continued with my investigation, following my client's spouse to a suburban house. It appeared to be another case of infidelity. Gathering evidence at homes was challenging, but my equipment was sophisticated enough to handle it. I aimed my microphone toward the house to capture the sounds and used my laptop to check the address. According to the data service I used, Bob and Sarah Mills had lived there for 12 years. I called my source for a background check, as I like to provide my clients with comprehensive information. She promised to get back to me, so I continued recording the sounds from the house. The noises were explicit and ongoing. I always wondered why the husband was cheating. I had met his wife, who was as attractive as the woman he was with. She didn't seem like someone who would always refuse her husband. I just needed to collect the evidence. My source called back, saying there was no significant background information on either person. It seemed like another marriage falling apart. I needed a few pictures as evidence to avoid having to return later. I took pictures of the car entering and leaving the premises. It turned out that Bob and Sarah Mills were old schoolmates, likely an old boyfriend and girlfriend rekindling past times. I hated cases involving children. I completed the photos and recordings and submitted them to my client, who informed me that Sarah was her rival from school. She had thought she won the man, but it turned out he wasn't as great as she had hoped. With my job done, the couples would resolve their issues in court. I headed home, reflecting on Peggy and little Trina, whom I had yet to meet. Some families had everything and wasted it, while others struggled to make ends meet. On Sunday, I stopped by my sister's house to discuss Peggy before meeting her on Monday. June greeted me with a warm hug, and her 2 kids ran out to greet me, calling Uncle Dan. Uncle Dan. June had been married for about 8 years to Bob, a skilled electronics technician. He was the reason I always had the latest equipment. As Bob cooked steaks and the kids played in the pool, June and I talked. "Well, what do you think of Peggy Sue?" I asked. "Dan, she's wonderful, bright, intelligent, and, as you know, beautiful. She picks things up quickly. I went over a few duties with her, and she learned them immediately. She's familiar with using a computer, although she'll need to learn our specific programs. I don't anticipate any problems." She did ask if she could bring Trina to the office for the first few weeks until she gets accustomed to her new medical routine. After that, she plans to enroll Trina in preschool. I said I'd discuss it with you, but I don't foresee any issues there. The only concern I see is that she seems to be quite fond of you, June added. "What do you mean?" I asked, surprised. "Dan, she's extremely grateful for everything you've done. It's clear she feels a deep sense of obligation." I was taken aback. "Come on, June, I only helped her out. She probably likes me because I assisted her and provided her with a job opportunity, but love, I'm about 16 years older than her." June looked serious. "Dan, she's genuinely appreciative of your help. I can see that she feels a deep sense of gratitude for everything you've done for her, but I'm talking about how she feels in her heart, Dan. She genuinely cares for you and would do anything for you. I really like Peggy, so please don't hurt her. She and her daughter have been through a lot." "God, June, the last thing I would want to do is hurt her. I promise you, I'll treat her well. If you think I'm mistreating her in any way, just let me know, and I'll make changes. Just take your time, Dan. Don't rush it, and everything will be okay. Now let's go enjoy those steaks Bob cooked up." June never held back, and I wondered if she had an inkling about my feelings for Peggy. I suppose time would tell. I told June I'd be late coming in on Monday as I had a few loose ends to tie up, and she could get Peggy started. I arrived around noon and found Peggy had parked her old car in my spot. I couldn't help but laugh. As I walked in, I saw June holding the most adorable little girl I had ever seen. She looked just like her mother. June kissed her on the cheek and set her down. The little girl walked over to me, and I picked her up. "Hi, sweetheart, and what's your name?" I asked. "Trina Williams," she replied. "Well, hi, Trina Williams. Glad to meet you. You can call me Uncle Dan." "Uncle Dan, my mommy said you saved my life." "Thank you," she said and gave me a big hug that brought tears to my eyes. It was the most touching thank you I had ever received. I looked over at June, and her eyes mirrored my own emotions. Peggy emerged from one of the offices and saw me holding Trina. She smiled until she noticed June and me with tears in our eyes. "Is something the matter?" she asked. "No, a little girl just made my day," I said, smiling. I asked Peggy to take her car down the road to the dealership and ask for Ray, who would show her some cars. Since she was working for us, she needed a more reliable vehicle. Peggy was about to mention money, but instead asked if she should take Trina with her. I told her we'd watch Trina while she went. Ray, the auto dealer, later told me that Peggy had arrived in her old car and was looking at used cars. When he told her she wasn't supposed to get one of those, she thought they were beyond her budget. Ray then took her into the showroom and explained that I wanted her to pick out a new car and we would cover the lease. He informed her there was a price limit, which I had set, but he wasn't supposed to tell her unless she went over it. Peggy was eyeing a Mercedes, which was almost double the limit I had set. Ray didn't say anything until she moved to the compact cars and chose one. She wanted a 4-door vehicle for Trina's car seat and preferred vinyl seats for easy cleaning. Ray told her she could opt for a bigger car if she wished. Peggy decided on the compact car, but requested it in blue, Trina's favorite color, and asked if they had a portable DVD player for the car. Ray confirmed they could get her the car in blue with the DVD player installed and mentioned that she could clean out her old car and transfer the child's seat. Ray later said he had asked Peggy about her interest in the Mercedes, and she mentioned that it was the same kind of car I drove, which made me smile. Peggy loved her new compact car, and after transferring her personal items and child's seat, she returned to the office. She parked in my spot again and greeted me with a big hug. "Oh, I'm sorry, you're my boss now," she said, making June and me laugh. Peggy had a knack for doing little things that made us laugh, and I really liked her. Over the next few days, Peggy and June became the best of friends, almost like sisters. It was wonderful to hear them laughing together from the office. Little Trina also frequently visited my office, sitting on my lap while I worked on the phone or computer. She would color or draw pictures, and I found myself deeply fond of her and her mother. Admitting my feelings for Peggy was difficult, but I knew I had a genuine connection with both of them. We maintained a professional relationship at the office, but a couple of times a week we would go out for dinner, always bringing Trina along. One morning, I decided to visit Mr. Harold Batty. I needed to be cautious around him, since I knew he had assaulted Peggy, and she wanted nothing to do with him. I had an appointment with him that morning. His secretary informed me that Mr. Batty was ready to see me after a short wait. "So, Mr. Gray, you're a private investigator. What can I do for you?" "Mr. Batty, I'm here on behalf of Peggy Sue Williams." "What's this about?" "That case is closed. I never assaulted anyone. We had consensual relations. If you have any other questions, you can contact my attorney. Now, please leave." "Okay, Mr. Batty, I'll head over to the newspaper and share information about your daughter, the one you don't acknowledge. With the special award coming next week, I'm sure they'd be interested in this story." "What child?" he asked, clearly agitated. "You son of a... I'm tired of playing games with you. The woman you had relations with about 5 years ago had a baby, your child. I have all the proof I need to go public with this, and I'm sure your wife, children, and grandchildren will be quite surprised to learn about this new family member." I saw the shock on his face. He had no idea Peggy had become pregnant. I noticed an inhaler on his desk, and he picked it up and took a sniff. "Mr. Batty, I might mention that your child has asthma as well. Seems it runs in the family. What do you want from me? How do I know you're not lying?" "Let's start with what I need for Peggy and your daughter. First, I want you to draft a letter relinquishing all parental rights to the child, stating you will have no involvement with either of them. This will ensure Peggy is the sole parent. Next, I want a cashier's check made out to Peggy Williams for $50,000 to cover past and future medical expenses, primarily due to the pregnancy and asthma." "That's blackmail. I could have you arrested." "No, you can't. I'm offering you a way out. Alternatively, you could cover all her medical bills and child support for the next 18 years. Then, the rest of your family and the public will be informed as well. I will provide you with a copy of your daughter's DNA to verify against your own. I'm sure your attorney will agree to this arrangement, although it does let you off the hook. I will return in 2 days to collect the letter and the check. If you prefer, we can settle this in court." I thanked him for his time and told him I would see myself out. When I returned to the office, June asked to speak with me privately. We went into my office, and she asked me when I was going to propose to Peggy. She said she could see how much I loved Peggy by the way I looked at her. "I'm taking it slow, just like you advised. I haven't even kissed her yet." I always told June the truth. I couldn't hide anything from her. I admitted that I thought I was in love with Peggy, stronger than I ever felt with any woman, even Margaret, to whom I was briefly married. But I was 16 years older than Peggy and wondered what our marriage would be like in the future. "That girl wants you. She tells me every day how much she loves you. Believe me, if you ask her, she'll say yes. Plus, you get to be a father figure to Trina. Even Trina loves you. She said if she had a daddy, she would want him to be just like Uncle Dan." I didn't know what to say. I asked June again if she was sure. She looked up at the ceiling in disbelief, and then walked out. I followed her and was approached by Peggy. "Dan, would you like to go on a real date with me? My roommate Sue is getting married on Saturday, and asked me to invite you to the wedding and reception. She's never met you and I talk about you all the time. Would you be my date?" Wow, I've never met her. I'd be honored to be your date. That was a positive step. Later, when June and I were alone, I asked about watching Trina on Saturday. She told me she and Peggy had already arranged that a week ago. "I was just asked to go," I said. June laughed and said she knew I would say yes. She had told Peggy to wait to ask me, knowing how I was with dates and appointments. "By the way, I'll be keeping Trina for the whole weekend. Peggy hasn't seen your condo yet, so Saturday might be a good day to show it to her. Just make sure she's back in time for work on Monday." June had always taken care of me after our parents died in a car accident when I was 22. Even though she was younger, she knew me better than I knew myself. A couple of days later, it was time to confront Mr. Batty again. I wondered how he would react. He had always been arrogant, but this time, he was facing a serious challenge. I approached his receptionist and asked to speak with Mr. Batty. She asked if I was Dan Gray, and I confirmed. She explained that Mr. Batty was unable to see me, but had instructed her to give me an envelope. She handed it to me, and I thanked her before leaving his office. Clearly, Mr. Batty was too intimidated to see me again. As soon as I got into my car, I opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000, along with a letter stating that he was relinquishing all parental rights to Trina. I was elated with the results. The note also mentioned, "Mr. Gray, my business with you is concluded. I expect this matter to finally be resolved and trust that you will honor your word." I took out my note from the envelope and closed it back up. Heading back to the office, I called Peggy and June in for a meeting. They both took a seat, and little Trina came over to sit on my lap. Peggy opened the envelope, took out the letter and the check, and looked at June for an explanation. June told her that Harold Batty wanted nothing to do with her or her child, and had given up any legal claim. Peggy was now the sole guardian of Trina. To assist with raising the child, he provided $50,000 on the condition that she would not disturb him again. "You mean this is my money, and I don't have to worry about anyone trying to take Trina from me?" Peggy asked. June nodded, and Peggy began to cry tears of joy. She stood up and said, "I don't care if you're my boss," and kissed me. A genuine, affectionate kiss. Then she embraced me tightly. June looked over and whispered, "I told you." Trina looked up and asked, "Mommy, why are you kissing Uncle Dan?" Peggy glanced at me and then at her daughter. "Because I love him, sweetheart, and I don't care if he knows." I was momentarily speechless, so I suggested we close up early and go out to celebrate. June called Bob and he, along with the kids, were to meet us at Red Lobster for dinner. Peggy remarked that she was unsure how I managed to get the letter and the money from Harold Batty, but she meant what she said in the office. I was often at a loss for words around Peggy lately. When the time came for me to express my feelings, I wanted everything to be perfect. The right mood, right time, right place. Trina wanted to sit next to me at the restaurant, ending up between Peggy and me. This eased some of the pressure until Trina looked up from the table and loudly asked, "Uncle Dan, do you love my mommy?" I wasn't sure what to say in front of everyone, so I told Trina I had a secret. She leaned in, and I whispered so only she could hear, "Yes, I love your mommy. And I love you too." She looked at me, either surprised or pleased, then stood on her chair and gave me a big hug. Turning to her mother, she said, "Mommy, Uncle Dan loves both of us." "That was supposed to be a secret," I replied. "You weren't supposed to tell anyone." Trina said, "I'm sorry, Uncle Dan, but I don't keep secrets from Mommy. She told me to tell her everything so she can protect me better." I looked around at the group laughing at the table and tried to ignore their comments. In 2 days, I would be going to a wedding with Peggy. Maybe the mood would be more conducive to romance. When I came into work on Friday, June handed me a check for $2,387, saying it was what Peggy owed me for paying the medical bills. She also gave me 3 $100 bills, explaining that Peggy wanted to return the extra money as she could now afford it. June laughed and said Peggy mentioned that if I ever felt she earned it, I could give it back to her. I picked up Peggy on Saturday afternoon for our date. Sue had already left for her wedding, which meant Peggy and Trina would be living in the trailer alone from now on. June was there to pick up Trina when I arrived. She looked around the trailer, then came up to me before Trina came out. "Big brother, follow your heart and do the right thing tonight." I understood her meaning and planned accordingly. June had never tried to set me up with anyone before, so her instincts must have been right. Peggy appeared at the door, looking angelic in blue. I could hardly describe my feelings at that moment. I took her hand and walked her to my car. She kissed her daughter goodbye, told her to be good for Aunt June, and hugged June, thanking her for everything. I opened the car door for Peggy and told her how beautiful she looked. We drove to the wedding, took our seats in the church, and as the ceremony began, I held Peggy's hands in mine. I watched as the bride walked down the aisle. To my surprise, the bride was an older woman, possibly near 60. It hadn't occurred to me that she might be older. As she walked by us, she smiled at Peggy, who had by then started tearing up. I handed her my handkerchief. I knew she was happy for her friend, but was probably also thinking about her own wedding and wondering if it would ever happen. At the reception, she introduced me to Sue. I said hello and offered my congratulations. It was very nice to finally meet her. She said, "Thank you for everything you've done for Peggy. I always wondered what a guardian angel looked like, and now I know," and then gave me a big hug. As the night progressed, I danced every slow dance with Peggy. I told her how beautiful she looked and how wonderful she smelled. "You better like it. You bought it for me," she said, referring to the lipstick and perfume I had chosen. I kept holding her close, then even closer. Sue, Peggy's friend, asked me for one dance. As we danced, she told me how much Peggy cared for me. It seemed everyone knew about it. Several men had asked Peggy to dance, but she had turned them all down. The groom asked her to dance, and they did for about a minute before Sue and I switched partners. I had Peggy back in my arms. I asked Peggy why she hadn't danced with anyone else. She said that this was our first real date, and she preferred to dance only with me. I decided it was time to be open with my feelings. Peggy and I went out on the patio where we were alone. I took a deep breath and began, "Peggy, I love you with all my heart and soul. I know you know that. It seems everyone knows it. I want you to marry me, but I'm afraid that our age difference might be a problem." She stopped me by putting a finger against my lips and then spoke, "Dan, ages mean nothing to me. I don't care if you are 22 or 62. You are the nicest, kindest, and most wonderful person I have ever met. I knew I loved you from the first night we were together. I was afraid I wasn't in your league, but the more I learned about you, the deeper I fell in love with you. If the offer is still open, I would love to marry you and be your wife." I kissed her with gentle, loving kisses. "Dan, there is something I need to tell you. I may not be very experienced in intimacy. You know I've had relationships because of my daughter, but I have never made love. I'm a bit scared that I might not be able to please you." I looked into her tear-filled eyes and said, "I want a partner who can share intimacy. Will you come home with me tonight so we can see how we connect? There's no doubt in my mind about our chemistry. I've wanted you since the night I picked you up. I haven't been with anyone else since then. I don't usually spend the night on a first date, but for you, I'll make an exception. Can we leave now and get a head start?" We bid farewell to Sue and her husband. I saw Peggy whisper in Sue's ear, and I knew she was telling her about my proposal. They hugged, and then we left. As we pulled up to my condo, Peggy was amazed by the pool, sauna, and hot tub. I asked if she wanted to start there, but she shook her head no. So we walked into my condo. She admired how beautiful it was but mentioned it could use a woman's touch. I agreed. There's something about the way a woman decorates that makes a place feel more like a home. I showed her through the rooms, and then to the master bedroom. She saw the king-sized bed, smiled at me, and said, "I want to begin there," pointing to the bed. There we were, in my bedroom. We were both a bit nervous. I had done this many times before, but it still made me anxious. I walked over to the CD player and put on a romantic disc with soft music playing in the background. I turned on a corner lamp and turned off the other lights. I asked Peggy if she wanted to continue, and she replied, "More than anything, just please be gentle with me." I reached for the zipper on her dress and slowly pulled it down, allowing the dress to slip to the floor. She stepped out of it, and I carefully draped it over a chair. I wrapped my arms around her and kissed her softly, savoring her delightful fragrance as our lips barely touched. As I removed my suit jacket, she was untying my tie. When I started to unbutton my shirt, she paused me, saying she wanted to do it. While I removed my shirt, she unbuckled my belt and unbuttoned my trousers. We were left in our undergarments. She sat on the edge of the bed, and I gently pushed her back so she was lying on her back, her legs hanging over the side. All the while, soft romantic music played in the background, and I could hear Peggy's soft sighs, which filled the air with a beautiful tension. Eventually, I leaned closer and she exclaimed, "Oh my! I've never felt anything like this," as she experienced a wave of delight. She moved to the center of the bed, and I joined her. "Dan, that was the most incredible feeling ever," she said. I started kissing her, and she responded with growing passion. "Dan, let me bring you joy. You've given me so much, and I want to do the same for you. I love you dearly." After we took a moment to catch our breath, Peggy was about to get up when she said, "I think I might have made a bit of a mess." We rested for a while, and I asked her if she had packed a swimsuit in her overnight bag. She held it up, and I suggested we cool off in the pool before returning to enjoy more intimate moments. "Dan, I love it when you say love instead of intimacy because with you, that's what it truly is. I've had experiences before, but I never really felt love until tonight. There's so much love within me, it just takes a little time to build up. Let's go to the pool and then come back and see what happens," she said. She put on a charming two-piece swimsuit that looked fantastic on her, and I slipped into my swim trunks. We headed to the pool, and afterward, she wanted to try the hot tub. Watching her in the tub was thrilling for me. I held her close, and she smiled at the excitement between us. "I think it's time to head back inside before we get into too much mischief," she said with a playful grin. After refreshing ourselves, we returned inside and started again. She was eager, and I began by being gentle. I lay across her, careful to support myself so that I wasn't putting all my weight on her. Everything felt so intense. Unchained melody played softly in the background, and I could hear the lyrics. "Oh my love, my darling, I hunger for your touch. Are you still mine? I need your love. Godspeed your love to me." At 38 years old, experiencing these feelings was new and profound. We were both exhausted from our time together. I let the music play but turned off the lights, just holding and cuddling with the woman I loved. The next morning, I woke up first and made some coffee. When I went back to the room, Peggy was awake. She asked if I still loved her and if my love was strong enough to consider her as my wife. I told her I had something for her. As I reached into the nightstand, she joked, "You're not going to give me the $300 back, are you?" Smiling, I pulled out an engagement ring and said, "No, not the $300, although you more than earned it. I have this instead. Will you marry me, Peggy Sue Williams, and make me the happiest man alive?" As I slid the ring onto her finger, she was still as she was, but she grabbed me and hugged me with tears in her eyes. "Yes, yes, 100 times yes, I will be your wife. You have made me the happiest woman on this planet." The rest of the weekend was a repeat of our wonderful time together. We went to work on Monday and June noticed the glow on both of us. "Hey, little brother, I've never seen you glow like this before. Must have been a fantastic wedding you went to," she said with a smile as I headed for my office. In the office, Trina was sitting at my desk, drawing. She told me she was the boss and giving the orders for the day. Peggy came in and laughed as she listened to her daughter giving out instructions. When Trina saw her mom, she ran to her. It was heartwarming to see their bond. Peggy showed Trina the engagement ring I had given her. Trina asked what it meant. "Well, sweetheart, it means that Mommy and Uncle Dan are going to get married," Peggy explained. Trina then asked, "What about me, Mommy?" "I'll answer that, Trina," I said. "You probably won't call me Uncle Dan anymore. You can call me Dad if you want." I saw tears in everyone's eyes. June's, Peggy's, and even little Trina's. I had tears in my own eyes too. Trina looked at me and then at her mom and said, "We're going to be a real family, just like on TV." I hoped our family would be even better than the TV families, but I remembered that Peggy had told me they liked watching classic family shows together. That's the kind of family I wanted us to be. We did get married soon after that special weekend. I adopted Trina, and our life together is wonderful. They moved into my condo, and now it truly feels like a home. To think it all began with a chance encounter with someone in need. It's one of the most unusual starts to a marriage I can imagine. I often wonder where she would be today if she had left that evening, or if I hadn't helped her. Looking back, I have to believe that fate played a role, guiding us together. I had never helped anyone in that way before, and probably won't again. There was something uniquely special about our meeting and our connection. Our intimacy is fulfilling, and though we wait for Trina to go to bed, the wait is always worth it. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.